Social Work Day. I think we should be sure to announce to the world that we in Kampala were perhaps the first to have such a major celebration by moving our march 2 days earlier and celebrating, calling everybody's attention to the fact that social workers are here ready to contribute. And that was such a wonderful march on Sunday. And our organizers, I understand, were quite wise to celebrate on Sunday and keep us out of the midweek traffic in downtown Kampala. Otherwise, there might not have been quite so many of us here. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. This has been such an exciting conference so far. And I've had the pleasure of serving on the International Association of Social Work, Schools of Social Work Board over the last several years. For a while with Prof Healy, and most recently with our conference chair, Janestic. So this is wonderful to come here and renew those friendships as well as others. What I'm going to share with you today are some things that actually you've been hearing about for the last several days in the presentation, the keynote presentation yesterday, the wonderful presentation that Roderick gave us, and also in a workshop session of Antoinette. But for those of you who are not social work educators, let me say that we educators, when one of our students says that something is repetitive, we say, oh no, it's reinforcement. So I hope that you will listen with that spirit and that I can share a few new things for you. It also perhaps shows in an exciting way that many of us really are in sync on some of these issues and recognize their importance to the world and to the profession. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to reference, of course, Social Work's global agenda and our commitments to action, and to tie them to some of the things that I've been involved in at the UN committee that I'm serving on. And then, of course, to turn back at the end to talking about where do we fit in as a social work profession. So by now, I think you've all heard that in 2012, World Social Work Day, 2 years ago, and then shortly thereafter at the United Nations, where annually we hold a Social Work Day at the United Nations. The three international bodies that represent our profession in the broader social welfare field, the three I's, IA, IF, and IC. My husband gets very tired of me talking about IA, IF, and IC. Launched the global agenda for social work and social development. What you may not know is how long it took to put this agenda together. It was a multi-year process of negotiations and work to develop this agenda, this forward-looking agenda. After a lot of back and forth around the globe, 4 broad goals were agreed on: promoting social and economic equality, promoting the dignity and worth of peoples, working toward environmental sustainability, and strengthening recognition of the importance of human relationships. Under these 4 broad goals, the agenda went further and committed social work to support the MDG process through to its conclusion. I use the word conclusion lightly. To work on the development of the post-2015 agenda that's going on the global level. To work toward the implementation of all major human rights treaties. To strengthen social work practice in areas such as conflict management, the attack on human trafficking and work on migration, to promote environmentally sustainable development processes, and to work on disaster prevention, mitigation, and response. It also calls on social work to promote policies to enhance social inclusion and cohesion, including attention to vulnerable groups, and to embed the importance of reducing social isolation and enhancing social interaction in social work policies, practice, including social work education. I represented, as Gidroff said, I represented the IASSW for about the last 7 or 8 years on a non-governmental organization committee on social development and its subcommittee on poverty eradication at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this process, many, many NGOs, I think there's about 3,000, that have consultative status with the United Nations. And our three professional organizations are among those. And this entitles us to do certain things. It entitles us to participate in UN activities, to issue statements at the major meetings, to have those officially translated into the UN languages and put up on the United Nations official website and record, and to attend and have certain rights, limited rights of participation in some of the UN meetings and processes. So for example, at the 52nd session, which was just held last month, IASSW and ICSW co-sponsored what's called a side event. It's a workshop at the Commission meeting, and we focused on global inequalities. As I think was mentioned yesterday in Roderick's presentation, 2015 will be undoubtedly a hallmark of some significance for the social development community, because it's the 20th anniversary of the major World Summit for Social Development that was held in 1995, and the Copenhagen Plan of Action that was agreed upon there. Out of that important meeting, 3 pillars of development were identified and agreed upon by the participating governments: poverty eradication, full employment and decent work. And that's an important "and" because it's not simply employment, but it's employment that respects human dignity and provides the means for a meaningful life. And social integration. Now, shortly thereafter, 5 years after Copenhagen, we had the Millennium Summit. And in a sense, global attention was diverted from the Copenhagen Plan of Action into the Millennium Development Goals. So we are now 2014. I think you all know by now that 2015 was the target for the achievement of most of the Millennium Development Goals. And so everyone is looking backward in a sense to say, how did we do? What did we achieve? What countries are doing well? What countries are struggling? And where do we go from here? Now, the MDGs get a mixed response around the world. They've been frequently criticized as being highly inadequate. Goal 1, for example, says to reduce by half the number of people living in extreme poverty. So if it's achieved, there are still millions and millions of people living in extreme poverty. And I actually read a chapter that Jonestic had contributed to a book published by the IFSW, where she talked about education and noted how the gains in education were, yes, education is free, more children are enrolled in primary school, but that doesn't mean that suddenly quality facilities and teachers and equal access suddenly appeared just because there's this goal that says all children must be enrolled in primary school. So we will see more attention perhaps on the qualitative side. We also know that if we disaggregated the progress by income levels, that we would find that most of the progress on the MDGs have been made among those in the higher income quintiles, not among the most severely impoverished. But nonetheless, as I said, if the goals were met, the lives of many would improve. So the final year of effort for the targets is important. Now, I don't think when we talk about the final year, I don't think that means that in 2015 they say, okay, goals are over, no more focus on poverty, education, etc. So I wanted to note that the PROSOO project has really been important in calling increased attention in social work education to work on these issues. Now, one of the more distressing realities is that in spite of Millennium Development Goal 1 on reducing extreme poverty, inequality over this period of time from 2000 to 2014 has increased. Inequality between nations and inequality within nations. We've seen growing inequality, and almost all of the post-fiscal crisis recovery has benefited the world's richest people. There have been a number of recent reports on the topic of inequality. This is the new topic, and I'm really glad to see the word inequality being used. Sometimes we just went through a strategic planning process at my university, and we kind of softened the word because inequality in the United States has actually become a politically charged word. So we called it disparities, which is kind of a nicer word for saying inequalities, unfortunately. So I'm really pleased to see this word inequality really highlighted in a number of these big global reports. Oxfam came out with a report in January that, they picked some really startling statistics. And these are just two of them that, as of now, the 85 richest people in the world own the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. Stunning. And in my own country, the USA, the wealthiest 1% have captured 95% of the gains since the financial crisis, while the bottom 90% got poorer. So these are huge issues. Even more, perhaps, concerning is this issue which some articles call opportunity hoarding by the wealthy. In that, increasingly, opportunity seems to accrue mainly to the wealthiest people. And I found a study that talked about this idea of inherited opportunity. Now, we all know that's existed for some time, but the statistics are pretty startling, and they differ from country to country. The examples that were used in the report were Denmark, which has a low Gini coefficient and is a low inequality country. 15% of a young adult's income can be predicted by his or her parents' income. In Peru, which is a very high inequality, high Gini coefficient country, fully 2/3 of a young adult's income can be predicted just by knowing what their parents' income was. So this idea of not only has inequality grown for the present, but it is likely that it will only grow faster in the future unless these policies are changed. I just point out that there is the United Nations DESA, Division of Economic and Social Affairs, also just launched 4 weeks ago their 2013 report on the world social situation with the title Inequality Matters. And if you want to see the report, the full report is available free at the UN website, or if you simply put in a search engine, Inequality Matters or Report of the World Social Situation 2013. One of the more interesting at the commission meetings, the governments make statements. Actually couldn't find any statements, not every government does this, and I couldn't find any government statements posted for the 4 country sponsors of this conference. But I found Brazil's to be particularly interesting. And Brazil's presentation really indicated that national policy can really make a difference in these inequality figures, even these big measures. And they have launched a sustained effort over about the last 10 years to try to reduce inequality by doing several things. They've adopted a minimum wage policy. They've reformed their tax system to create more balance. And they have launched a extensive program of different kinds of family payments and grants. Their experiments with the conditional cash transfer program known as the Bolsa Família is pretty well known in the international literature. It was used to provide a grant that would try to reduce child labor and increase children's enrollment and success in school by making a modest payment to families if they kept their children in school and got them minimal health care. And that's been widely copied, not only in other Latin American countries, but also in some African countries. And they've started some new cash transfer programs, a new grant for families that couldn't access the Bolsa Familia, which was only for families with school-age children, such as families of the elderly. And they now have a Bolsa Verde, meaning green, to encourage forest preservation. So their attack on inequality, interestingly, if you think about the dimensions, they have given attention to the social, the economic, and the environmental pillars of development. They still have a ways to go, but I think Brazil is showing that through purposeful government policy, a difference can be made in these dreadful statistics, and perhaps begin to change the opportunity hoarding situation. I might mention also, before I leave the area of inequality and poverty, that there has been an effort to redefine the way we define poverty, I guess, is to try to look at poverty not only in terms of these big macroeconomic measures or even broad summative measures like literacy rates and lifespan, but to look at what's now called one of these is the multidimensional poverty index. And this is a set of 10 indicators that tries to measure levels of deprivation as they're experienced on the ground by families. And so if you're not familiar with that, I think it's an interesting thing. I show it to my students who take an international development class that I teach and have them look at it, critique it. Of course, I think your students would probably do better with this because they're closer to the situation. But it's an attempt again to look at, what does it mean? How is poverty actually experienced? And with the efforts they've done to use these measures, they find that levels of poverty per country differ from measures like the Human Development Index, if you look at the poverty index. I remember Ethiopia being one particular example that on the MMPI, the poverty rates are significantly higher than they are in looking at the Human Development Index. While in Vietnam, it's the reverse is true. Sadly, perhaps for social work, I had a colleague in the United States who in 1984 developed a very comprehensive index to measure social progress. Richard Estes of the University of Pennsylvania, perhaps his index was too complex to really catch on because he originally started out with 44 indicators and ended up at 48 indicators. But again, he took the social and also the idea of government effort into account in developing his measures. Another big issue that we're following in the Social Development Commission is the area of human rights, especially human rights as it relates to the themes in the development agenda. At the Commission meeting, there was an emphasis and a lot of calls for development to be firmly anchored in human rights. And poverty has been recognized as a significant human rights issue, probably beginning with the term of Mary Robinson as UN High Commissioner, and continuing under the current High Commissioner, Pillay, who is from South Africa. Our NGO committee has been active over the past, it's been a long process in developing these guidelines, but the Human Rights Council has appointed a special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. And her task was to develop, with extensive consultations, a set of guidelines on extreme poverty and human rights. And these were adopted by the Human Rights Council about a year and a half ago. This is a new human rights document putting this recognition of poverty as a human rights violation into international human rights, I can't say law because this is a non-binding document. In fact, it was not terribly enthusiastically received by the General Assembly. I can't remember if they used the word accepted or recognized or received with appreciation. But anyway, whatever the diplomatic language was, it was not an enthusiastic acceptance of this document. So I think although the IASSW has called for a convention on poverty and human rights, I think that's a long way in the future. But the introduction to this document says that extreme poverty, as we all know, results in a prolonged lack of basic security that severely compromises people's chances of exercising their human rights. Social work has a long history of supporting human rights, and human rights is incorporated in all of the major international social work policies. Certainly all of those that have come out since the year 2000, the global definition, the ethical document, and the global standards for social work education and training. In a recent report, so I think that social work's commitment to human rights is there. It needs a lot more flesh on it to make it a reality. We need to increase our practitioners and students' understanding of the role that these treaties play. And I thought this was an interesting statement that was given by one of the leading NGOs at our recent commission meeting. They said the treaties transform the discourse from respecting a set of rights to coming into compliance with international standards. So if you think of it this way, this provides lots of openings for social work to use these human rights treaties for advocacy, to hold governments and others accountable, and to assist vulnerable groups. However, social work needs to go beneath the surface in understanding of human rights. And the treaties that are of special interest to social work, treaties such as, of course, the Treaty on Social and Economic Rights, but also the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the newer Treaty on Persons with Disabilities. Those treaties challenge accepted social and cultural patterns and reorder social relations if implemented. They deal with issues like gender, the role of children in families, marriage equality, and others. And these are not easy issues to tackle. And I know many of you recognize that in your daily practice. And they're not comfortable issues. So while it's very easy to quote the Universal Declaration, it's much more challenging to put into social work practice and to deal with these challenging issues in some of the treaties. I came across a quote in a paper that I actually recently wrote with Hugo Kamya. I came across this quote as I was doing the research. In 1968, the International Social Work Conference focused on the topic of human rights. So we're not newcomers to this theme. In fact, I found historically that social work writers were using the term human rights about 25 years before the Universal Declaration was launched. But this speaker, Gore of India, said the following. He said the human rights perspective has the advantage of clarifying what the moorings and long-term objectives of social work are. It will disturb the complacence of the individual social worker, who may be tempted to acquiesce in the values of the local community, even when they conflict with the broader values of the profession. It will require and compel the organized profession, meaning our associations, to take clear positions on social issues. I think that's a quote well worth thinking about, and again, for you educators, perhaps having your students dissect this a little further. Turning to another burning issue, perhaps the burning issue on the international agenda, once you get beyond the peace and security issues, the whole post-2015 agenda process that we've talked about here. This is again, okay, the MDGs said 2015, what next? Where does the global attention turn? And this has been a multi-year, multi-stakeholder process to look at what did we learn from the MDG process and how can we enhance some of what has gone on and create a stronger process going forward. There have been many, many groups that have been working on this, official groups put together by the United Nations, non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, an increasing involvement of the business community to the concern of some. One of the major groups is this high-level panel that's been working and seeking consultations around the world. In their report about 10 months ago, they said that their research to date it suggested 5 transformational shifts, using their language. The first, ending extreme poverty and ensuring universal human rights. When I read that, I couldn't believe they put those together in one statement. I mean, talk about a huge agenda for the globe. But they did. And I don't know if that suggests some lack of respect for the complexities of those 2 issues. Secondly, putting sustainability at the core of development. Third, building economies for jobs and inclusive growth, because we know that the recovery from the fiscal crisis has been the opposite. It's been what's called jobless growth, and it has excluded many from progress. Emphasizing peace and good governance. And finally, the need to forge a new global partnership that brings in more actively not only governments, but civil society, academics, business, and those people who are actually living in poverty. At the recent commission and listening to the various sessions and listening to the NGO committee and some of the major speakers, these are some of the ideas that are particularly gaining strength as we move toward conclusion of this process. It's pretty definite that there will be a strong emphasis on sustainability in the environment. In fact, if this the document will include new goals, and they will be called Sustainable Development Goals. Part of this is coming out of the Rio conference that was held. There's a pressure group, a big pressure group, advocating for a standalone goal in the agenda on gender. You can read women. They changed the word to gender, but they really mean women. Kind of interesting, you know, but anyway, there's a lot of pressure to have a standalone goal on gender because they recognize the extreme inadequacy. And finally, something that will be a change, it'll be interesting to see how this turns out. The idea that this post-2015 agenda should be a single and universally applicable global agenda to bring, to affect all countries. The MDGs, especially goals 1 through 6, and actually even goal 7 on environment, the way it was stated, really were about the developing countries. And only goal 8 called on the rest of the world to pay much attention. So this new process is intended to bring everyone into the process. Before I comment on social protection, I just say that this agenda setting process is important, and there are lots of avenues for involvement. Even at this stage, there are consultations that you can get involved in, either through your associations or individually, and I would encourage you to do so. But there is this growing recognition that social protection and security are critical to growth and prosperity. One of the biggest challenges in Africa is certainly, and other countries in Asia, is the informal sector. Most traditional social security systems were employment-based, and they left out workers in the informal sector, which in many countries is the majority.